Hello all and welcome. You are tuned in to the Planet of Horror, where we cover your worst nightmares. Every week we dive deep into the darkest corners of the human mind, unravelling the twisted, the terrifying and the truth. From chilling cold cases to notorious serial killers, cults, disappearances and unsolved mysteries. So why not join us for the journey and discover the deepest horrors of humanity with us. Subscribe and hit that bell notification to make sure you never miss an update. Charming, handsome, soft-spoken, but behind that smile there was a trail of blood across America. In the fall of 1974, a man named Paul John Knowles went on a killing spree that spanned over 4,000 miles. Nicknamed the Casanova Killer for his looks and his deadly charm, Knowles claimed the lives of 18 victims, maybe more. Tonight we uncover the terrifying timeline of one of America's most unpredictable serial killers, so without further ado, let's dive in. The year was 1974. The scene, Railford Prison in California, now known as Florida State Prison. Inside sat Paul John Knowles. He's in love with a divorcee named Angela Kovic. After writing to each other for a while, and Angela coming to visit, they get engaged. Angela paid for Knowles' legal counsel, and upon his release, he flew directly to California to be with her and plan the wedding. All was not well though, and a few days before the wedding, Angela calls it off, saying he projected an aura of fear that terrified her. She would have no idea how right she would end up being. Knowles returned to his hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. Rejected, upset, he went out drinking, and he soon got himself arrested after stabbing a bartender during a fight. While in the detention center, he picked the lock of the cell and escaped. This is when his horrific 4-month multi-state crime spree began and earned him a place as one of the worst serial killers in American history. Let's start at the beginning. Paul John Knowles was born April 1946 and grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. He was reported to have been an uncontrollable child, intelligent, but his need for attention and impulse control issues were apparent right from the start. By the time he was 7, he was stealing bikes from the local area, and it wasn't long before like-minded kids gathered around him like flies, impressed by his crimes and general disdain for authority and rules, which only fueled his growing ego. At 9, he was caught stealing, which must have been a breaking point for his parents, who, at this point, put him up for adoption. This must have added a new layer to Knowles, giving him lifelong abandonment issues. Knowles spent the rest of his childhood in the system, in and out of reform institutions and foster homes, but they did not handle him any better. He was sent to Florida School for Boys 6 times on charges ranging from breaking and entering to grand larceny. But Knowles had no interest in reforming. He would get out and go right back to committing crimes until he got caught again. Knowles was also obsessed with outlaws and gangsters, people like Babyface Nelson, an armed bank robber and gang leader, amongst others. People who swept across America, leaving bloody devastation in their wake. Old acquaintances of Knowles would even say he loved to be flattered by being told how bad he was, that he would tell them that one day he would be this big famous bad guy. It really seemed like reading about these outlaws had a massive effect on Knowles. These people really seemed to be his heroes. At age 19, Knowles picked up his first official charge as an adult and entered the prison system. He was stopped by police while driving a stolen car. When the officer approached his vehicle, Knowles grabbed his gun and forced the officer into his car. He did release him 2 hours later unharmed, but this incident earned him 5 years in state prison for kidnapping. From this point, Knowles roughly spent 6 months of every year in jail. In total, he spent nearly 9 years in the prison system, and during that time he was described as a loner, antisocial, profiting from neither experience nor punishment. There was a brief period where Knowles tried to go straight and settle down with single mother Jackie Knight and her kids, but after he struggled to find work as an ex-con, he went back to his criminal ways, which resulted in Jackie leaving him and moving to Macon, Georgia. However, they remained in contact. It does say that they were briefly married, but Jackie managed to get it annulled, so I can't imagine that lasted very long. In late 1973, during another stint in prison, is when Knowles began writing to Angela Kovic. He'd found her in an astrology magazine, and they both bonded over their mutual love for it. Knowles was somewhat superstitious, meticulously reading his daily horoscopes every day. After a while of writing to each other, Angela came to visit him, and they got on so well that Knowles proposed to her, and they got engaged. Then Angela paid for his lawyer to secure his early parole, which was granted, and obviously this decision was criticised considering how little he'd attempted to reform in his past. Chairman Ray Howard would say it was granted for 3 reasons. 1, he was due release in a year anyway. 2, he was planning to move away from his hometown to be with Angela, and this would mean he'd be away from bad influences that would pull him back into crime. 3, California officials agreed to supervise him. From this point, as we know, after Knowles was released, he flew to San Francisco to be with Angela. However, a few days before the wedding, she called it off, rejected Knowles, flew back to Jacksonville, and got himself arrested for stabbing a bartender in a fight. Once in the detention cell, he picked the lock and escaped. Knowles was on the run and needed to get away fast. He needed to create as much distance between him and the police as possible. For this, he needed a vehicle and money, both of which he did not have. So he made the decision to invade the nearby home of Alice Curtis, a 65-year-old retired teacher. It's not clear whether he forced his way in or somehow got Alice to invite him in. But either way, once he was inside, he overpowered her, tied her up, gagged her, then proceeded to ransack the house for her money, valuables, and car keys. This seemed to be his only intention, robbery, but unfortunately, when he tied Alice up, her dentures had been dislodged by the gag, and they were forced down her throat, causing her to choke to death. Her death appeared to be accidental, but it did awaken something in Knowles. He may not have meant to kill her, but he liked what it now gave him: power, status, freedom. A lot of professionals believe he sensed his own power for the first time in his life. He was now a murderer. He was the big bad guy he always wanted to be. I personally think that up till this point, he lacked the bravery in the sense to do it. That he wanted to be this big bad guy, but was never able to go as far as killing someone. maybe due to being scared of the potential consequence of the death sentence, as this is something he gets very paranoid about later. Now, however, whether he meant to or not, he had killed someone, while fleeing an escape too. The consequence he was scared of is potentially going to happen now, no matter how many people he kills. So he might as well make himself famous and live his life to the fullest while he can, a sentiment which he also echoes later on. A lot of people blame his breakup with Angela as being the trigger for his killings, but I think it was this accidental kill, that if Alice didn't accidentally choke, he wouldn't have murdered anyone else. Knowles was like a scared kid standing on the edge of a drop slide his whole life. He wanted to go down, even excited, but couldn't quite push himself off the edge. Alice was someone pushing him down, and once you've been down once and experienced the thrill, the fear is gone and it's not so hard to do it again. Knowles was smart. He scored 125 on the intelligence test while in prison, which was above average for the population and amazing for a prison inmate. But he was impulsive, like kidnapping the police officer. In situations where he's been caught and can't get out of it, he seems to just escalate. And what's an escalation to accidental murder? Doing it on purpose. Knowles did claim to kill 3 people in San Francisco in the time period after Angela broke things off and before he flew back to Jacksonville, but authorities were never able to confirm this. Plus, it didn't seem like he actually planned to kill anyone up to this point. But that would soon change. He left Alice's home in her white Dodge Dart and drove west to Jacksonville to hide out with friends. He didn't lay low for long though. Knowles would strike again less than a week later on August 1st, and this time he wouldn't just kill one person. It was 6 p.m. 2 young girls, Lillian, aged 11, and her sister Marlette, aged 6, were home alone. Their mother and older sister had popped out to check on a nearby ill relative. Their father was due home at 7 p.m, so the girls were only expected to be alone for an hour. Unfortunately, that was all the time Knowles needed. When Lillian and Marlette's parents came home, they were gone. With the assistance from local authorities, they conducted a 149 square mile search for the girls, but no trace was found. Both the girls had medical conditions which required medication, so time was crucial. Their parents were beside themselves. They would continue to worry, search, and pray for their babies until the following January, when authorities listened to a taped diary Knowles kept. On these tapes, Knowles took credit for the deaths of the 2 little girls. He explained he'd been trying to abandon Alice's car nearby when he spotted the girls watching him from a window. He got paranoid and convinced himself that if he left them, they would tell their parents they saw him. You see, the girls were not strangers to Knowles. Their mother, Elizabeth, was friends with Knowles' mother. So he lured the little girls into the stolen car, drove them to a remote location, strangled them both. Afterwards, he then dumped their bodies in a swamp. Upon hearing this taped confession, the police searched all the swamps in the area, but failed to find the little girls. Because of this, even though Knowles claims credit for their disappearances, the official case still remains open. 2nd of August. Knowles has now theoretically killed 3 people and needed to create more distance between himself and his crimes. So he decides to drive to Macon, Georgia, where his friend Jackie Knight lived. You know, the girl he briefly married but kept in contact with? Knowles would make a stop on his way to Jackie's to get more money. He broke into the home of Marjorie in Atlantic Beach. He would unalive her with a nylon stocking and escape with her money and valuables, including a TV that he would later give to Jackie as a gift when he got there. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be his only kill on this trip. We don't know the exact date Emma ran into Knowles, but we know it was around this time from Knowles' diary tapes that would be discovered after he was caught. Emma was only 13, but despite her young age, she was strong-willed and fiercely independent. After her parents divorced in 1968, she lived with her dad in Texas, but would frequently run away. Her disappearances were so common, her family rarely notified the authorities. They knew she would turn up sooner or later, which is a factor in why exact dates are unknown. In July, Emma got on a bus to Warner Robins, Georgia, where her mother and stepdad lived. Emma's 4-year-old sister Sharon was thrilled to see her. On the 1st of August, Emma was asked to babysit her little sister, but a few hours after being left alone with Sharon, some of Emma's friends showed up in a van. Emma told Sharon to go inside and lock the door, and then she left with her friends. This was the last time anyone would see Emma. The events in between her leaving her friends and meeting Knowles is unknown. We don't really know how or why she left her friends, but we know from Knowles' diary tapes he picked up a teenage hitchhiker he referred to as Alma, not far from Warner Robins. He said he took her to a wooded area and raped and unalived her, then left her body between some trees. Then, interestingly, for reasons unknown, 2 weeks later he would return to this crime scene, see some animals had disturbed Emma's body, and then bury part of her jawbone, then left. Knowles didn't give any reason as to why he returned to this crime scene, nor did he ever say that he returned to any other crime scene apart from this one, so we really don't know why it was different. On August 23rd, Knowles had been with Jackie for a while now. He was running low on funds and overstaying his welcome, so he went on a drive and ended up in Missoula in Crawford County, where he knocked on the door of 24-year-old Kathy, a divorcee with a 3-year-old son. She was home alone with her son when Knowles targeted their home. Once inside, Knowles started demanding money from Kathy. Kathy tried to scream and possibly call for help as the phone was ripped off the wall and Knowles had used the cable to unalive her, which points towards an angry, impulsive act, leading people to believe it's likely that she tried to use it, triggering Knowles. Once he had done, he moved Kathy to the bathroom, grabbed as much cash as he could find, and ran. He left Kathy's little boy unharmed, but he did leave him alone in the house with his mother's body until the father of Kathy's boyfriend came round to check on them and found the scene. He called the police and they tried to question the little boy, but he was too young to provide many details. At this point in the timeline, none of Knowles' crimes have been linked together, never mind to him. He's moving around so much and his victims are so random, there's no real pattern to follow, other than someone having a break-in and then being killed. On September 3rd, Knowles had finally overstayed his welcome and he decides it's time to head north. It doesn't seem like he has much of a plan, other than to create as much distance between him and each crime as he possibly can. Knowles found himself in Lima, Ohio, and decides to go for a drink at Scott's Inn. Inside, he strikes up a conversation with a man named William Bates. a 32-year-old account executive. The barman knew Bates and watched as he exclusively chatted with Knowles. He would claim they left together, and then Bates was never seen alive again. Mrs. Bates, William's wife, would soon report her husband missing when he didn't return home. Authorities would investigate and find a white Dodge Dart near the bar, which would track back to the owner being Alice, Knowles' first victim. Bates would remain missing until Thanksgiving, when a hunter found his naked, tied-up body. He had been unalived. The way Bates was found led authorities to believe Knowles had lured him out of the bar with the promise of being intimate. It's unclear whether this was just to get Bates out of the bar, or whether Knowles actually was sexually attracted, as there was reports Knowles was intimate with other men in jail. Either way, William Bates lost his life to this monster. Knowles took Bates's money, credit cards, and he also used the opportunity to switch cars, taking Bates' car and leaving Alice's near the bar. Later on, authorities would examine Bates's credit card transactions after they were stolen and determine Knowles left Lima and went east to Missoula, then went south to Utah. The trail would go cold in Ely, Nevada, where Knowles had maxed out Bates's credit cards. Now he needed a way to get his hands on more money. At some point during this road trip, Knowles had obtained a gun, and on the 12th of September he would use it to overpower Emmett and Lois, an elderly couple in their 60s who were on holiday in their camper. Knowles tied them up and used the gun to unalive them. He then ran with their money and valuables. The couple would remain undiscovered until the 18th, 6 days later, by which point Knowles had long left the state. And this kind of thing is the reason I believe he's one of the worst serial killers, because it's not as if he's even going out to kill people. It seems like more of an afterthought, his intention is to rob them, he wants their money and valuables, and then it's while I'm here, I might as well kill them so I can make myself famous. It's so dehumanizing to the victims, even more so than your average serial killer. On the 21st of September, Knowles was driving through Seguin, Texas, when he spotted a woman named Charlene, a 42-year-old widow, stopped at a rest stop. She was on her way to a chili cooking contest in San Marcos. One account of the scene said that Charlene was having car problems and Knowles offered to help. Another said she was simply stopping to take a break and look at the view. Either way, we know Knowles must have made some kind of excuse to talk to Charlene. When she failed to show up in San Marcos, Charlene's family would report her missing. Authorities started to search and soon tracked her last known whereabouts to that rest stop on Route 10. On the 25th, they found her nude body in the brush near the highway. The injuries on her body suggested that Knowles had dragged her to that location through a barbed wire fence that separated the brush from the road. Charlene's murder would unfortunately remain unsolved until Knowles confessed to it 2 months later. 2 days later, on the 23rd, Knowles ran into a woman named Anne, a 49-year-old beautician. Something must have been different about their meeting compared to his other victims, because he actually travelled with Anne for 6 days before killing her on the 29th. We don't know if Anne was travelling with him willingly or if she was a hostage, because Knowles did have a history of taking people hostage. However, he did only seem to do that when he was on the verge of being caught, so I don't really think that he would have taken her hostage. Knowles said he killed her because he was tired of her and then dumped her body in the Mississippi River. Her remains were found in the Mississippi on November the 15th, 1977, by 2 squirrel hunters. Maybe Anne pandered to his ego at first, as his ex Jackie would say that he liked her after an interaction where Knowles claimed he would be this big bad guy one day, and Jackie replied, "Oh, she better get his autograph now," which suggests he liked women that fueled his ego. It was also found that Anne paid for all the bills while they were together, which she must have got sick of, so maybe Knowles got rid of her once he couldn't get any more out of her. Knowles sets off travelling again, driving through Oklahoma, Missouri and Minnesota, and as far as we're aware, he didn't kill anyone during these next few weeks. That is until October 16th, when he walked up to the home of Dawn in Marlborough, Connecticut, and knocked on the door. Dawn was only 16 and home alone. Knowles forced his way inside, tied her up, raped her, and then when her mother came home, he subjected her to the same treatment. After, he unalived them both and grabbed what he could, including a tape recorder, which we think this is the recorder that he used to start taping his diary tapes, and some of Dawn's records, which he would later give to Jackie's kids as gifts when he went back to hers, which A, shows you how little value that he has for these people, that he's just giving their stuff away, and B, it's just stupid because you're basically just giving evidence away. But then again, Knowles isn't really planning to get away with any of this. 3 days later, Knowles would make another pit stop in Woodford, Virginia. He persuaded or forced 53-year-old Doris to let him into her home. Once he got inside, he demanded that Doris show him where her husband kept his gun. Believing that he would leave once he got what he wanted, Doris led him to the study. Once Doris got out the gun, Knowles grabbed it, shot her, wiped his prints from the gun, and then left it next to her body, before grabbing all of her money and valuables and running. Which I'm really not sure why you would do that, other than enjoying prolonging the lady's fear. He didn't take the gun, so he had no reason to demand her go find it, because it's not like he had any trouble overpowering people, because he'd done it to many other women that were obviously fitter than a 53-year-old. The only thing I can think of is, like I said, that he was just trying to play games, he was enjoying it at this point. It wasn't just about the robbery and the murder as an afterthought, which is pretty sadistic and shows a level of escalation. It shows that he's not just murdering purely for the fact to be famous anymore, or purely as an afterthought to the robbery. He's actually enjoying doing this now. At this point, Knowles knew he'd killed enough people to guarantee his fame. There was only one problem. Nobody knew. None of these kills had been linked together or to him. Knowles needed a way to get his story out. He needed someone that could make his crimes known, but who wouldn't turn on him. Someone that would agree to do it on his terms. And Knowles knew exactly the right person for the job, and began to drive towards California. On his way, however, in Key West, Knowles would pick up a pair of hitchhikers and offer to drive them to Miami. He completely had the intention to kill these two, but fortunately for them, Knowles was stopped by police for a traffic violation. The officer let him go with a warning, but it did save this couple's life. because Knowles knew there was no way he could kill them now when the police had saw him with them. So he did as he promised, and he dropped them off in Miami unharmed. And you might think, oh no, he just got away. Like, if the police had just ran his identification, they would have seen he was at least on the run from escaping from prison and arrested him. But honestly, and this will come apparent to you later on, it was probably best for that couple that the policeman didn't do that, because it would have ended a lot worse. Next, Knowles went to see the right person for the job, his lawyer Sheldon Yarriff. Once in his office, Knowles presented Sheldon with three things: a set of audio tapes, a letter to be opened after his death, and a shocking proclamation: "I'm a mass murderer." Now, you might be thinking, this is the end of the story. Knowles confessed. He gave his lawyer evidence. But unfortunately, it's not. See, Sheldon was no ordinary lawyer. By 1974, his criminal law practice was booming, and he liked professional criminals. He wasn't judgmental. He didn't bat an eye to most of the crimes his clients committed. His clients included people like Cuban gang members, jewel thieves, and one to note was a burglary ring who gave Sheldon a sports car in lieu of money. Now, Sheldon knew most of his clients were not innocent. His court tactics rarely focused on the actual facts of the case, but instead were more sneaky, using technicalities such as improper search and seizures to secure his client's freedom. On that October day, when Knowles came into Sheldon's office, he handed him his audio tapes, a vague description of their content, calling his murders successes, which is so dehumanizing and disgusting. After, Knowles told Sheldon that he wanted him to make sure the press and the public knew about his crimes after his death. He wanted to secure his fame. Now, in Sheldon's defense, he did try to convince Knowles to just surrender now, but Knowles insisted he'd rather be shot down in a blaze of glory like Bonnie and Clyde, which speaks to his actions, like he really never planned to be caught, never actually see the inside of a jail cell. Knowles knew he'd committed murder in multiple death penalty states. Even if he was caught, his days were numbered. And I think there's a saying that perfectly fits this situation. The most dangerous person is the one with nothing to lose. And that's very much Knowles at this point. He feels either way, his story is going to lead to his death. So he might as well make it as glorious as possible. And that to Knowles means being the big famous bad guy he always wanted. Now, there does seem to be some confusion about this particular event. Some of the resources I looked at said that Knowles didn't physically go to Sheldon's office, but instead mailed him the audio tapes. But to me it makes more sense that he did go there in person, because he could have mailed the audio tapes from anywhere in the country. So why would he have driven to Miami if he wasn't planning to go to Sheldon in person? But I guess either way, whichever version is true, at this point in the timeline, Knowles' lawyer is in possession of these audio tapes and agrees to hold them and not give them to the media until after Knowles' death. Now Knowles has secured his fame, he decides to head back to Jackie's in Macon, Georgia. On his way, Knowles possibly picked up another pair of hitchhikers, Edward and Debbie, who disappeared while hitchhiking near Macon, Georgia. Edward's body was found in nearby woodlands with 5 bullet holes. Debbie's body, however, unfortunately wasn't found until August 29th, 1975, in Crawford County, but some of her belongings were found near Edward at the time. We don't know for certain that Knowles killed these pair, but considering the location and the timing of their disappearances, plus Knowles' history, like he literally just picked up a pair of hitchhikers that he was planning to kill but had to let go, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think he was trying to make up for the pair that he couldn't kill. He's strongly suspected for their murders. On the night of the 6th of November in Milledgeville, Georgia, Knowles targeted a 45-year-old man named Carswell. Knowles befriended him in a local bar and got him to invite him back to his home for the night. Once inside, Knowles tied up naked Carswell with his hands behind his back and then, we think, began to torture him as he was found with multiple stab wounds. Carswell ultimately died of a heart attack that we think was brought on by Knowles' attacks. And if that wasn't bad enough, Knowles also unalived Carswell's 15-year-old daughter, Amanda, with an increased degree of violence compared to his other victims. Authorities also thought he'd attempted to be intimate with her, but couldn't perform because there was no semen present at the scene. He then took what money and valuables he could and ran. Now, analysing this scene, it does seem like Knowles is struggling with gay feelings himself, as Carswell isn't the first victim authorities thought was lured away through promises of being intimate and that were found naked too. Plus, you add in the degree of violence that he killed his daughter with, it does seem like he's angry at himself that he can't perform with women and maybe, like I say, struggling with gay feelings. Obviously, none of that is an excuse to be killing people. I'm more just analysing the psychology. Carswell's wife found the scene the next morning, which must have been awful and heartbreaking. Authorities began to search for clues. They found a pair of scissors in the home that were used to stab Carswell. They had no prints on them though, which I think is Knowles more trying to delay them catching him rather than thinking it would stop them doing so. Mrs. Carswell provided a list with items that were missing from their home, and authorities found the local bar Carswell was in and got a statement from the bartender that he saw him talking to a man that fit Knowles' description, although they didn't know that at the time. Police then immediately called all local departments and put a statement out to the public with the description of the man they're looking for. A good-looking man with red hair and a Zapata mustache, which I'll leave a reference on the screen of what kind of mustache that looks like because I had no idea. A sales clerk at a department store in Macon would see the news coverage of the murders and come forward to say a man matching the description came into the store and bought a tape recorder and 4 blank tapes. When this was investigated, it was found that these items were also bought with Carswell's credit card, which is what I mean by Knowles just delaying them. That, or he is just stupid, because why would you wipe your prints but then use their credit card? The fact he bought 4 blank tapes though is rather concerning, because he's using these to record his kills. So with that in mind, he must have been planning to kill enough people to fill them. Knowles at this point stays within Georgia and drives to Atlanta, where he uses Carswell's credit card again to book a hotel room. Once settled in, he decides to go for a drink. This is when he meets British journalist Sandy. She was initially impressed by his good looks and let Knowles buy her a drink. He told Sandy he was Darrell Golden, a businessman from New Mexico, in town to oversee a court case involving a restaurant chain that his dad owned. Sandy refused his advances at first, joking he could be the next Boston Strangler for all she knew, which is an eerily close joke, and Knowles probably loved it. It probably fueled his ego. By the end of the night, the pair were up in Sandy's hotel room, but Knowles couldn't get himself to work, if you know what I mean. Sandy reassured him that he'd had a lot to drink, and they cuddled, with Sandy making another joke. "So you're not another Boston Strangler after all. How disappointing." A joke which probably led Knowles to make some of his next decisions. The next day, Knowles blocked all Sandy's efforts to leave him. When she had an interview to conduct, Knowles insisted on driving her there instead of her getting a taxi. Sandy had plans to fly to her next assignment, but as she was leaving the hotel, Knowles stopped her, saying his court case had been settled out of court, so he now was free, suggesting they spend the time Sandy has left in the city together. Which, I think all of this was Knowles either trying to work up the courage or a plan to confess to Sandy without getting immediately caught, as she was a journalist and could make him famous. They got some drinks together, and at some point Knowles told her he'd been lying and asked if she would write a book about him, as he hasn't got long left to live. Sandy at first made the assumption Knowles was terminally ill, as I'm sure most people would, but Knowles soon clarified he thought he was going to be killed soon, maybe in 2 days, maybe in 2 months, but someone was going to kill him for something he'd done in his past. He wouldn't tell Sandy what it is that he'd done, but he did tell her about the audio tapes with his lawyer that would be released after his death, adding they will make world headlines. Sandy thought he was half joking, but was so intrigued that she postponed her flight. She was more thinking Knowles had committed hit and run rather than being a serial killer, as the pair ended up driving to Florida together, and I'm sure if she really had any knowledge about who Knowles really was, she wouldn't have got in the car with him. Over the drive, Knowles told Sandy about his failed relationships, how he wanted to get married, but how he didn't see much point anymore, as he was going to die soon. Sandy would try to push him into talking about what exactly he'd done to make someone want to kill him, but Knowles wouldn't say. The two did bond over the course of the drive though. Sandy would tell him about her upbringing in an orphanage, and would say Knowles seemed to really understand her struggles and trauma. He had a lot of it himself growing up in the system too. Next, Knowles went with Sandy to a scheduled interview with the United States Attorney William J. Saxby about the spew of early parolees, which A, is ironic, as Knowles was an early parolee himself and wasn't exactly giving them a good image, and B, this topic was getting a lot of media attention at the time, which Knowles must have loved being around. After a while though, Sandy was getting sick of Knowles, but Knowles wanted to stay close, I think because he loved this new world that had opened up for him. All the media attention he could soak up via proxy, maybe because at this time he really thought he would be dead before his limelight would come. He didn't want to let it go. After a week, Sandy did manage to shake Knowles, evading him each time he called her room or hung out in the bar at whatever hotel she was at. Eventually, he did give up, but he didn't exactly go quietly. In a state of rejection, Knowles met James and Susan, a British couple who were friends with Sandy. They felt sorry for Knowles, being rejected and being so alone. When Susan had a hair appointment, Knowles offered to drive her, which she accepted. The couple saw Knowles as a nice, polite and respectful young man, just looking for some company. They couldn't have been more wrong. Shortly into Knowles driving Susan, he asked her for sex. A shocked Susan refused, which triggered Knowles into pulling out a pistol and aiming it at her. Susan wasn't going to cower though, and immediately fought back. She managed to get the car door open and started to get out when Knowles grabbed her by her hair and tried to drag her back in. Luckily for Susan though, she managed to get loose, flag down a passing motorist and get away. Personally, I think this attack was largely triggered by Sandy. As she would say during her time with Knowles, he never managed to perform, which he probably blamed for Sandy losing interest. Like, I think Knowles' original plan was that he wanted to have sex with her friend, thinking this would in some way show Sandy she was the problem. You know, like, I was able to perform with her, so you're the reason I couldn't. Then, when Susan rejected him too, he became enraged and acted impulsively, as usual. This was the beginning of the end for Knowles. Susan would go right to police reporting the incident. She gave authorities the car model, a description, and what she thought was his name, Darryl Golden. A call went out to all local departments to be on the lookout for this man. It wouldn't take long before an officer spotted Knowles and pulled him over. However, when the officer got close to the car, Knowles pulled out a sawn-off shotgun. The officer dropped to the ground to protect himself, and Knowles fled. Now he needed to ditch this car. He also needed another one, and he needed to do this quick. So Knowles went to the home of Beverly in West Palm Beach. He walked up to the door and told her his name was Bob Williams from Internal Revenue Services and requested to come inside. Once in, he started demanding her car keys and told her he needed to use her as a hostage because he was on the run from police. There was only one problem with Knowles' plan. Beverly didn't own a car, but Knowles wasn't going to leave. Meanwhile, Beverly's sister Barbara had dropped her 6-year-old son off at school that morning, then started doing some work. At some point in the late afternoon, she calls her sister, but she didn't answer. She always answered. So Barbara picked up her little boy from school and headed over to check on Beverly. When she got there, she was met with a horrifying scene. As her and her son entered the home, they were met with Knowles aiming a sawn-off shotgun at them. Barbara demanded to see her sister. She found Beverly nude, gagged, and tied up in her bedroom. She turned to Knowles and shouted, "Did you grape my sister? Because if you did, I'm going to kill you." Knowles laughed at her and replied, "I tried." Next, Knowles demanded money and her car. Barbara cooperated, giving him her car keys and whatever money she had and or could find. This isn't the end though. Next, he told her he was taking her son as a hostage. Beverly was not having that though, not her son. So she convinced Knowles to take her instead. But before leaving, Knowles ties up Barbara's son next to her nude sister, which Barbara said was horrible to watch, but she had to get Knowles out of the house, away from them, so they would be safe. Which is an incredibly brave thing to do, agree to get in a car with a man which, at the very least, you know just attacked your sister, has a gun, and is on the run from police. Like, that's a dangerous man, even without knowing everything else. As they drove north along the interstate, Knowles was intently listening to the radio, flipping channels and getting madder. I think he expected more of a manhunt to be going on for him, and the more he was going through the channels and none of them were talking about him, the madder he got. I think this because he then turned to Barbara and confessed he's killed people. Barbara was terrified by this proclamation, but was smart. She knew the best way to get out of this was to get Knowles to like her. So she started chatting to him, being nice to him. She offered him a cigarette and called him Love. This initially took Knowles off guard. "Why are you calling me Love?" Barbara replies, "Why not? You're not a bad person." After this interaction, Knowles was more receptive to Barbara, chatting with her, telling her how nice it is to talk to someone, as he'd been sat in silence with Beverly most of the day. Which, good on Barbara for keeping her cool in that moment, because I don't think I would have. Beverly must have at some point during her time with Knowles told him what her sister does for a living, because next he asks Barbara about her writing. She clarifies she works for a radio show as a copywriter. Knowles asks her if she can write a book. Barbara responds, "Why do you want to write a book?" Knowles says, "Because he wants to be famous." Barbara asks, "What do you want to be famous for?" Knowles didn't respond, and Barbara didn't push. This is interesting because you can see it two ways. One, Knowles didn't want to admit to his crimes, but then he already told her he's killed people, so he could have just responded with that, for killing people. Or two, he just wanted fame. What it was for didn't really matter to him, and so he didn't really have an answer to the question. As the pair continue to drive north, the car Knowles stole from William Bates has been found in Palm Beach. Inside the car were credit cards and insurance documents belonging to one of his other victims, Carswell. They also find a will in the car, the name on it, Paul John Knowles. But there was also another name on it, his attorney, Sheldon. Authorities call Sheldon, and he advises them Knowles hired him to help with his early release, and told them to search his criminal history, and that would tell them everything they needed. So they did, and within hours they had Knowles' fingerprints and a photo. They knew exactly who they were looking for now. The net was closing in. Though I hate the fact that Sheldon didn't tell them about the audio tapes or what Knowles had confessed to him. Like, attorney-client confidentiality doesn't apply if the information told to them indicates future crimes. Plus, he was on the run. Fairly sure that could be considered harboring a fugitive, surely. Meanwhile, back with Knowles, he stops at a motel in Fort Pierce. Barbara tries to convince him to just leave her and take off with the car, but he refuses, advising her, "You're coming with me." Over the course of the night in that motel, Barbara said he raped her 3, maybe 4 times, but he couldn't finish, and this was getting him angrier and angrier. He grabbed her, started pulling her hair, trying to break her fingers. But when she screamed and asked him what he's doing, he flipped and started apologizing. Barbara described him as Jacqueline Hyde, never knowing from one point to the next how he was going to act, which must have been terrifying, like this person just completely flipping personalities every 5 minutes. Knowles then tied her up so she couldn't escape overnight. When Barbara woke up, Knowles untied her and put the news on. He was on it. He was wanted for murder and the kidnapping of Barbara. Barbara was able to find out from this that her sister and son were safe. Her son managed to untie himself and Beverly and then get help from a neighbour. She was relieved. At least her family was safe. But she had to stay cool because Knowles was intensely engrossed in the TV and she didn't want to upset him. As the pair sat there, the police are hard at work trying to gather information and track Knowles down. The more they dug, the increasingly concerned they became. Rightly so. They knew the car he was driving, as by this point Barbara had already spoken to them and given them everything. At the time she spoke to them, she gave a description of Bob Williams, and it was so close to that of the one of Darryl Golden, they started to think they were the same person. It was only a matter of time now before they found him. Authorities tracked Sandy down as she was friends with Darryl Golden. They half wanted to know more information, half wanted to check she didn't have any involvement in his crimes, as the Cars murders, for example, they thought originally was done by two people. Sandy was shocked by what the police were telling her, and at this point they only knew about 3 murders, 2 attempted rapes, and 1 kidnapping. Things were going to get a whole lot worse. Which, side note though, I don't like the wording of attempted rape, as this minimises the trauma. It makes you think he didn't actually do it when he did. Just because he didn't finish doesn't mean it was any less traumatic for the woman. Like, isn't it rather misogynistic to say that if a man doesn't finish, then he only attempted? But I guess we have to consider the time period that this is set in as well. Authorities showed Sandy some photographs of stolen items missing from the Car's home, and she would recognise some of the clothes because Knowles had been wearing them. When asked if Knowles had given her anything, Sandy hands over a Mickey Mouse watch, which they later determined belonged to 15-year-old Amanda. It's one thing to write about challenging and violent people. It's another to find out not only were you riding in a car with a killer, but you bonded with him. You enjoyed the things he paid for with a dead man's credit card. It must have been a horrible feeling to go through. Until her death in 2005, Sandy always wondered why Knowles spared her. She suspected it was because he wanted her to write a book about him, which, yeah, makes sense. But also, he must have liked being around the media world. I think he wanted to see what it was like, because he thought he would be dead before his spotlight came. The next morning, with Knowles, he took Barbara to a small local diner for some food. Him and Barbara sat there in a booth while Knowles hid a shotgun under a coat on the seat next to him, aimed straight at Barbara. Barbara would say she was surprised no one in the diner recognised them from the news. She started to feel like no one was going to save her, but she also didn't want to draw attention to herself because she didn't want to get anyone hurt by Knowles. She also realises she's going to have to keep acting nice to him. Next, he took her back to the motel and raped her again. And once again, he couldn't finish and got angry. Barbara would comfort and reassure him, trying to avoid being the outlet for his anger. At some point, Knowles tied Barbara back up to the bed in the room again and left to make a phone call. As Barbara lay there, she looked over to the side table and realises Knowles has accidentally left the motel key in the room. The door automatically locked when Knowles walked out, and he doesn't have another key. Knowles begins banging on the door, but he can't get inside. This was the break Barbara needed. After a while of trying to get in, Knowles shouts through the door, "When they find you, don't tell police I hurt you." Then adds, "I love you," oddly. Then the scene went silent. Barbara was too scared to shout in case Knowles was still outside and hurt someone else. So she waited. After a few hours, she started to wiggle out of her restraints. When she got loose, she immediately rang the front desk and told them who she was and that she'd been kidnapped by a serial killer. It wouldn't be long before the FBI showed up to rescue Barbara. They led her to the front office where she had a phone call waiting. It was her sister Beverly and her son, They spoke and cried together, just so happy that each other are okay. Now, it was November 16th, Barbara was saved, but authorities had a new problem. Knowles was in the wind. A bolo was put out to be on the lookout for Barbara's car, and it wouldn't take long before 35-year-old Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Charles was patrolling near Perry, Florida, when he spotted Knowles and pulled him over. Like the officer before, Knowles pulled out a shotgun on him before the trooper had chance to react, but this time he wasn't looking to flee. Knowles handcuffed Charles and took him hostage in the back of his own patrol car, then drove off, ditching Barbara's car. This could be seen as Knowles escalating, but considering A, just how convinced he was going to die soon, and B, how many times he's referenced going out in a blaze of glory or comparing himself to outlaws that were killed by law enforcement, it was never Knowles' plan to surrender. A passing motorist witnessed the kidnapping, drove to a nearby phone box and called the police. But unfortunately, by the time they got there, Knowles was long gone. This was a very impulsive decision though, and Knowles drove away in a stolen patrol car with a hostage trooper in tow and realises he isn't going to get far like this. So he used the police siren to stop a 29-year-old motorist named James. He was a businessman, only in town for a few days. When Knowles pulled him over, he pulled the shotgun on him too and forced him into the back seat of his own car, before moving Charles from the patrol car to James's car too, then drove off in it, ditching the patrol car. Now, Knowles has a new car and 2 hostages. Later that day, Knowles stops at a gas station in Lakeland to buy some cigarettes. The cashier at the time did wonder why there was a trooper in the back of his car, but brushed it off. It wasn't until later on, where he saw the details of the kidnapping on TV, that he put 2 and 2 together and reported it to the authorities, giving them a description of James's car. They now have a description of his new car, and on November 17th, 2 Georgia Sheriff's deputies spotted Knowles' car travelling along Highway 42. They called this in to law enforcement, and they soon set up a roadblock a bit further ahead, knowing Knowles was going to hit it. One of the law enforcement officers at the roadblock said they'd never seen so many police in one area. They had helicopters, multiple departments of police, FBI, local law enforcement. They were ready to take Knowles down. When Knowles encountered the roadblock in Henry, you would think he would know when to give up. But he doesn't, and he decides to crash right through it. The impact sent the car crashing into a tree. Knowles then jumps out of the car and starts running into Henry County woods, firing back at police as he went to try and stop them pursuing him. Back at the scene of the crash, the police run to the crash car to see if anyone's hurt, but there's no one inside. No sign of where Charles and James are. There's no blood, so hope remained they would be found alive. But a new sense of urgency hit the police. They now had 2 actively missing people, and they needed to find Knowles, and they needed him alive. They searched the woodland for hours, but no luck finding Knowles. Knowles was running through the woods like his life depended on it. Eventually, he would emerge at the woodland's edge and was spotted by a local resident, David, who was out rabbit hunting. Knowles was exhausted and actively bleeding from being shot in the leg by police while he was running. Upon seeing this, David was obviously hesitant, pulled his gun on Knowles and approached. Knowles had run out of bullets, which is probably why he decided to look helpless instead. "Please help me," Knowles would say to David. David escorted Knowles to a nearby house for help and called the police. When a squad car showed up, Knowles was arrested and taken to a nearby medical facility to have his wounds seen to. Once he was given the all clear, he was taken to Henry County Jail. Knowles had finally been caught, and despite his efforts to force police to kill him, he was alive, for now at least. Word of Knowles' arrest spread fast. Before anyone knew it, reporters descended on the jail. Knowles loved it. This is what he wanted, what he did everything for. Reporters closed in on him like a celebrity, shouting questions at him, taking his picture. He felt so important. The police, however, were not so impressed. They just wanted to know where Charles and James are, what Knowles had done with them. But Knowles' ego barely fit through the door at this point. He had the upper hand. The police needed him. Knowles wouldn't tell them anything, where they were, or if they were alive or dead. He just wanted to play games. He toyed with authorities, saying one word would reveal where the men are, but he wouldn't tell them what this magic word was.
We're here trying to recover our missing trooper, which was kidnapped in the state of Florida, along with another hostage and brought into the state of Georgia.
A widespread search was organised to look for the pair, with everyone joining in from off-duty officers to volunteers. They were on the clock, temperatures were dropping. If there's any chance they were alive, they needed to find them soon, or they would fall victim to the elements. The search, unfortunately, came up short. Their next move, in a desperate effort to get Knowles to give up information, they arranged for Sandy to come and talk to him, hoping she would be able to get Knowles to cooperate. However, this plan was cancelled when authorities found out Sandy had offered an exclusive to an Atlanta newspaper, which I think was a pretty crappy move for her to do. Like, it does make you question her character when it seems like she cared more about using Knowles' story to benefit her own career than helping these two men. Charles and James would be found on the 20th of November when some deer hunters in Pulaski County, Georgia, made a horrible discovery. Charles and James had been handcuffed to a tree and shot execution style. When Knowles was informed of the discovery, he smiled and told police the magic word had been Baptist, because there was a Baptist brewery nearby where the men had been found. Pleased with himself, Knowles laughed, which is so disgusting. Next, Knowles' lawyer Sheldon would arrive from Miami and noted two things about their first meeting. One, Knowles was filled with a sense of accomplishment. Two, he was incredibly unnerved about the idea of being put to death. They discussed his death options, quite rightly thinking Knowles' chances of avoiding it were low. I don't want to be executed. I don't want them to fry me. That's a bad way to go. Well, how about if they hung you? Would that be alright? No, I don't want that either. Sure, I'd take poison, but I want you to do whatever it takes to keep me alive. Which is an interesting exchange, because it's like how Barbara described him, like Jacqueline Hyde. He wants to go down in a blaze of glory with police where he doesn't care if he dies. Now he's asking Sheldon to do whatever it takes to keep him alive. But next, he just starts confessing to crimes they haven't even linked him to yet, surely upping his chances of the death sentence. This man literally makes no sense, and that's why he's so unpredictable. When asked how many people he has killed, Knowles traces a number 18 on the palm of his hand with his finger. When asked where these murders took place, he writes down Texas, Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Connecticut, and Mississippi. Now, Knowles did claim in other interviews he'd killed as many as 35 people. However, he's only officially been linked to 18. like he first admitted. And this is probably why, in cases where they couldn't find a body, it remains open, because Knowles lied a lot. When photos of Knowles were published in the newspapers all over the country, Knowles' good looks soon gave him the name the Casanova Killer, which personally I don't think is even an accurate name. Like, yeah, some of his victims he did charm into going with him, but that was like 2 out of 18. Most of them he just walked up to their door and lied to get them to let him in, or just forced his way in. He was more of a thug than a charming man. And even in cases where people have said they found him like charming, it's more in like a vulnerable, him playing like a victim kind of way, not in this kind of like, ooh, I'm so suave and charming. Like, no. Knowles was getting caught up in the media attention and made the fortunate mistake of letting it slip about the audio tapes he gave to Sheldon, saying their content would make him even more famous, which was an incredibly stupid move on his part if he's trying to avoid the death sentence. Yeah, just hand them over evidence. I do find it frustrating that a lot of the resources I looked at to research this case described Knowles as such a smart person, but I personally don't see it. I see him as a man just making one impulsively stupid decision to the next, and the only reason he got as far as he did was pure luck and distance. Sheldon was then ordered to hand over the audio tapes, but he refused, citing attorney-client privilege. The tapes were being kept in a safety deposit box Sheldon owned, but he won't tell authorities the location of it or the code to it, nor would his wife. So they were both jailed on contempt charges. Which, you might be thinking, why was Sheldon so loyal to Knowles? And well, I don't think he was. I think him refusing was more about his image and personal safety. Sheldon ran a business representing criminals, some of which were members of organised crime. If he cooperated with police, not only would it affect his clients trusting him, but you gotta think, if he was so willing to keep those tapes for Knowles, he probably had other things on other clients. And if he rolled on Knowles, they may think that he would also roll on them too, putting a massive target on him and his family, especially at this time when things like, gangsters and mob bosses were a very real thing to be scared of. Eventually, Sheldon would give in, mostly to get his wife out of jail. He surrendered 2 packages of audio tapes and documents. Amongst the documents were instructions to Sheldon about how to get his story out, even giving him tips on the kind of thing Knowles wanted: books, movies, TV, which speaks volumes to how little he cared about his victims and how little remorse he had. There was no tell the victims' families I'm sorry. It was all about him and his fame. Despite Sheldon eventually handing over the items, he was ordered to appear in court to present the case as to why he shouldn't be held in criminal contempt for refusing to tell them about the audio tapes in the first place. After all, the only reason they knew about them was because Knowles had mentioned it. Unable to post bail, Sheldon remained in jail until his court date. His defense attorney, a man which Sheldon had mentored in the past, tried to get Sheldon's charges dismissed using the Fourth Amendment, citing attorney-client privilege, which was immediately denied, as it should be. And there's 2 reasons why. 1, it doesn't cover communication that would enable his client to commit a crime, regardless of if the police are aware of it or not. Sheldon knew when Knowles dropped the tapes off that he wasn't going to stop, and at the very least knew he wouldn't surrender, which would result in a shootout with police, which is obviously a crime. Even if we hypothetically say that Sheldon really did believe he wouldn't go on killing after he admitted he's a mass murderer. 2. Any confidentiality regarding the tapes were lost the moment Knowles told people about them, as he undermined the confidential nature of them. Meanwhile, Knowles was being bombarded with charges. He was taken to Baldwin Courthouse for the murders of the Carrs, Carswell and Amanda. Knowles was thrilled, loving life. People lined the streets to see him, hanging out of windows and off rooftops, just to catch a glimpse of him going into court. Reports from the courthouse would say Knowles was smiling at everyone, and at no point tried to hide he was enjoying the attention. Not even the angry presence of the victim's family was going to stop him. Authorities were also coming at Knowles from every angle. Georgia wanted him for the murders he committed there. Florida wanted him for the murders of Marjorie and Alice. Damn, Alabama even wanted to question him for the murder of a man stabbed to death in a motel. And this is probably why it took so long to sort everything out, because there were so many different states involved, so many different departments, so much information they had to gather. On the 4th of December, Knowles was secretly transferred to Douglas County Jail, because the jail was considered more equipped to contain a prisoner who had a history of escaping, which makes me think he must have been saying or doing something that would make them concerned he was going to try, because if it was purely based on his history, surely he'd have been moved there in the first place. I also think removing him from media attention was probably a factor, as it must have been hard for law enforcement to watch Knowles be so happy with himself for committing such horrible crimes. By no one knowing his location, they were at least able to remove the attention he was able to get. In mid-December, Knowles agreed to show Sheriff Lee where he'd put the gun that belonged to the trooper he kidnapped and killed. It's not actually clear whether Knowles agreed to cooperate or if he was the one that made the suggestion. Either way, this was an important piece of evidence to recover, as it was the murder weapon of Charles and James. On the 18th of December, Sheriff Lee and Georgia Bureau Investigation Agent Ron secured Knowles in their patrol car and drove him to Henry County, where Knowles assured them he would find the weapon. Lee was driving, Ron was in the passenger seat, and Knowles was in the back with both his hands and ankles cuffed. As they drove on Route 20, Lee suddenly noticed Knowles had managed to light a cigarette. He slowed down the car and demanded Knowles to hand it over. Knowles put it out, then lunged. With one wrist now suddenly free, he grabbed Lee's gun, which went off in the holster. Lee fought to push Knowles into the back seat area, while he was also trying to get control of the car, as they were swerving all over the place after Knowles lunged. At some point, Ron in the passenger seat drew his weapon, and when he had the chance, shot Knowles 3 times. Once in the chest, once in his right arm, and the third one hit him right in the head. The car skidded off the highway and went down an embankment. The officers got out and checked on Knowles. He was dead. The officers reported the incident back to head office, and Knowles was officially pronounced dead at the scene. When investigating, they actually found a piece of a broken paperclip sticking out of the lock of the handcuff that was still on Knowles' wrist. That's how he'd got his hands loose. Which makes sense, because that's how he escaped the first time, picking the lock, so we know he has a history of being able to do that.
The man got a handcuff off, and he went for my gun, and he got his hands on my gun. And, you come to your own conclusion, but I'm pretty shook up. I know he would have taken my life.
I began firing and continued firing until I was satisfied that the danger had subsided to both Sheriff Lee and myself.
Interestingly, in the aftermath, there was an inquest into the events that led up to Knowles' death. The inquest jury believed Knowles conned the police into taking him out so he could attempt to escape. But Knowles' attorneys thought different. They didn't believe he would have tried to escape, saying he didn't want to die. Which, yeah, he said, but then he also went on to blab about the tapes, which would have made the death sentence more likely, so he consistently contradicted himself. The attorneys thought the police had set Knowles up for an execution. They claimed to have a letter from a former cellmate of Knowles, who said Knowles told him he believed he was going to be killed before the trial. Now, I believe that was probably real, but Knowles believed for a while he was going to be killed. He made similar statements to Sandy that somebody was going to kill him. So, was he worried the police were actually planning something? Or was he just preparing himself for it happening? Because he knew he was planning to escape. Like, the fact he made similar statements before he was caught kind of shows he didn't really think shooting his way out of it was going to work. He knew the likely outcome would be him getting himself killed. And the inquest did conclude that the police were not responsible for any wrongdoings. Which, in this case, I believe is right. I don't think the police tried to kill him. Like, you can't really plan the severity of a car crash, and why would they risk their own lives? If they were planning to kill him, why wouldn't they just wait till they got out of the car and say he tried to run? Now, Knowles' dead body was taken to a nearby funeral home. Weirdly, the staff there reported as soon as they got the body, they were bombarded with phone calls from fans wanting to see the body of a mass murderer, which is so weird. This time especially is a very weird time when people were just obsessed with serial killers, especially the good-looking ones. And not like it is now, where people love to consume the content of true crime cases, but for the most part we agree that these people are monsters. Back then, it's like people acted as if they were boy band members. I want you to marry me and have my babies kind of obsessed. Now we're going to move on to the aftermath of Knowles' crimes. The families of Knowles' victims suffered for years after his death. They never had closure in some cases, and didn't get justice in others. Jack, the father of the two little girls, sued Knowles' estate for damages, and according to his wife, Jack never accepted they were dead. They never moved, they never changed their contact details, in hopes the girls would one day return. Which I completely understand, since their bodies were never found. Knowles did claim credit for their murders, but he also claimed to kill people that he didn't. Now, unfortunately, it is very likely Knowles did. He gave too many details for it simply to be made up. The other cases where he claimed to kill people, he gave incredibly vague details about it. Like the 3 people in San Francisco, he never gave names or details like he did with the girls. But I know if I was in that father's shoes, there would be a part of me that would still hope he's lying until I actually saw proof. Once Jack died in 1994, his wife bought memorial headstones for the girls and put them in their family plot. Their bodies to this day have still never been found, which is so sad. Moving on, it wasn't until April 1976 that the skeletal remains of Emma were found in a woodland off Highway 96. At the time, they were unable to identify the remains, and they would remain unidentified for 37 years. until January 2011, when the mother and sister, Sharon, submitted DNA samples to authorities. They'd been hoping this whole time Emma just ran off and started a new life somewhere, but they needed to check. Unfortunately, their DNA did match the skeletal remains, and they were officially identified as Emma. Next, authorities wanted to compare Knowles' audio tapes to what they knew happened to Emma, as they knew Knowles was in the area and operating at the time of her death. The problem was, the only copies of the tapes had been destroyed years ago, when the courthouse they were held in had a flood. Fortunately, in some archives, they did find a written summary of Knowles' audio tape confessions, at least of his Georgia victims. Details in one passage said he picked up a white female hitchhiker named Alma, which is very close to Emma. He may have misheard her. He said he took her to a wooded area, like where Emma was found, and the most compelling detail was when he described returning to the scene, seeing animals had disturbed the body, and then buried part of the jawbone, as the jawbone was missing from the skeletal remains of Emma, making it extremely likely Emma was the victim Alma Knowles was talking about. So that was the case of Paul John Knowles, the Casanova Killer. As we've seen, Knowles was more than just a charming drifter. He was a cold-blooded killer who left a trail of devastation across America in 1974. His 18 confirmed victims, possibly more, ranged from strangers to those who trusted him. With each crime, he became more reckless and more violent. This case forces us to confront the chilling truth that not all predators look like monsters. Sometimes they're smooth talkers with good looks and a smile. His killing spree was short, just over 4 months, but the impact was deep and lasting. It's a stark reminder of how easily trust can be exploited, and how evil can wear a very human face. While Knowles met his end at the hands of law enforcement, many of his victims and their families never received the justice or closure they deserved. His legacy lives on, not in infamy, but in the scars left behind. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this case as chilling as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest corners of true crime. What did you think about the Casanova Killer? Was he a product of his environment, or simply evil? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. And until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always be careful who you trust.